What if the most dangerous attack on Russia isn't coming from NATO, isn't coming from Ukraine, and isn't coming from the West at all? What if it's coming from Russia's best friend, quietly, politely, with a smile and a handshake? Because right now, while the world watches missiles and tanks, something much bigger is happening in the shadows. And Vladimir Putin, one of the most feared leaders on Earth, may be completely powerless to stop it. Before we go deeper, do me one small favor. If you love understanding what's really happening behind the headlines, hit that subscribe button right now, tap the like, and share this video with one friend who thinks they understand geopolitics. Trust me, by the end of this video, both of you will see the world map very differently. Let's begin. To understand how China is slowly swallowing Russia, you first need to understand something strange. Russia and China are not old friends, not even close. For most of modern history, they were rivals. Sometimes they were almost enemies. In 1969, Soviet and Chinese soldiers actually shot at each other along their shared border. Real bullets, real deaths. For a moment, the world feared a full war between the two communist giants. The hatred ran so deep that China eventually opened up to America, partly just to protect itself from Moscow. So how did we get from that to today, where Putin and Xi Jinping call each other dear friend and talk about a partnership with, quote, no limits? The answer is simple: desperation. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Within weeks, the West hit Moscow with the largest sanctions package in modern history. Russian banks were cut off from the global financial system. Western companies packed up and left. McDonald's, IKEA, Visa, MasterCard, Apple, Toyota, gone. Hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian central bank reserves were frozen overnight. Russia suddenly found itself locked out of the world it had traded with for 30 years. And when a country that size gets locked out of one door, it has to find another one. That other door was China. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable for Moscow. Because China didn't open that door out of friendship. China opened it out of opportunity. And there is a massive difference between the two. Think about it like this. When your neighbor's house is on fire and he comes knocking, you can help him for free. Or you can rent him a room at triple the price. China chose to rent the room, and Russia had no choice but to pay. Let's look at the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that no speech from the Kremlin can hide. Before the war, trade between Russia and China was significant but balanced enough. After the sanctions hit, it exploded. By 2023, trade between the two countries crossed roughly $240 billion, a record high. On paper, that sounds like a win for Russia. New markets, new money, new lifeline. But look closer and the picture changes completely. Russia now sells China mostly raw materials: oil, gas, coal, timber, metals, the kind of things a colony sells to an empire. And what does China sell Russia in return? Cars, electronics, machinery, smartphones, finished high-value products. Chinese car brands, which barely existed in Russia before 2022, now dominate the Russian market. Walk through Moscow today, and you'll see Sherry, Haval, and Geely everywhere Western brands used to be. Chinese smartphones replaced iPhones and Samsungs on store shelves. Chinese machines replaced German ones in Russian factories. In economic terms, Russia is starting to look less like China's partner and more like China's supplier. And it gets deeper, much deeper. Because it's not just about what Russia sells, it's about what currency Russia is forced to use. Cut off from dollars and euros, Russia began settling more and more of its trade in Chinese yuan. Today, the yuan has become one of the most traded currencies on the Russian exchange. Russian companies save in yuan. Russian banks lend in yuan. Even Russia's national wealth fund holds a huge share of its assets in yuan. Stop and think about what that actually means. Russia's financial system, the bloodstream of its entire economy, now depends on a currency that is fully controlled by Beijing. China can adjust the value of the yuan. China controls the rules of the yuan, which means China now holds a quiet liver inside the Russian economy itself. No army needed, no invasion needed, just a currency. And here's the part that must sting the most in the Kremlin. China doesn't even pretend this is a partnership of equals when money is on the table. Take oil. Russia desperately needed buyers after Europe turned away. China happily bought Russian oil, but at a discount, a big one. Russian crude has sold to Chinese buyers at prices well below the global market rate. Beijing knew Moscow had nowhere else to go, so Beijing squeezed, politely, silently, but firmly. Or take gas. For years, Putin has pushed a massive new pipeline project called Power of Siberia 2, a pipeline that would carry Siberian gas that once flowed to Europe straight into China. Russia needs this pipeline badly. It would replace the European market Russia lost. And China's response? Delay. Negotiate. Delay again. Beijing has reportedly demanded prices close to Russia's own heavily subsidized domestic rates. In other words, China essentially said, sure, we'll take your gas, almost for free. Imagine that for a second. Russia, the energy superpower that once made all of Europe nervous every winter, is now begging its neighbor to buy gas at bargain prices. And the neighbor still hasn't fully said yes. That's not friendship. That's leverage. And China is using it masterfully. Now, some people will say, okay, so China has economic power over Russia. Big deal. Countries depend on each other all the time. Germany depends on trade. Japan depends on imports. Why is this different? Here's why it's different. Because with Russia and China, there's history involved. Bloody, unresolved, deeply emotional history. And that history involves land. A lot of land. If you're finding this as fascinating as I did when I researched it, here's my one request in the middle of this story. Pause for 2 seconds, hit the like button, and drop the word silent in the comments. It tells me you're paying attention, and it tells YouTube to show this video to more curious minds like you. Now, back to the story, because this next part is where things get truly wild. In the mid-1800s, China was weak. The Qing dynasty was collapsing, torn apart by rebellion at home and European powers abroad. Historians call this period the Century of Humiliation, and every Chinese schoolchild learns about it today. And during that century of weakness, Russia moved in. Through 2 treaties, the Treaty of Aigan in 1858 and the Treaty of Beijing in 1860, Russia took a gigantic slice of territory from China. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, a region known as Outer Manchuria, land along the Amur River, land along the Pacific coast. That land today includes one of Russia's most important cities, Vladivostok, home of Russia's Pacific Fleet, Russia's window to Asia. But here's the detail most people don't know. In China, Vladivostok has another name, an older name, Haishanwai, and China has never fully let it go. In fact, in 2023, China's Ministry of Natural Resources issued mapping guidelines requiring that Chinese maps display the old Chinese names alongside Russian names for 8 locations in the Russian Far East, including Vladivostok. Officially, it was presented as a technical historical matter. Unofficially, it was a message, a quiet reminder that Beijing remembers exactly which lands were taken and exactly when. Now, does China plan to militarily take this land back? Almost certainly not. That's not how modern China operates. And honestly, that's what makes this story so much more chilling. Because China doesn't need to invade the Russian Far East. It just needs to wait and fill the vacuum. Look at the demographics, because this is where the math becomes almost frightening. The Russian Far East is enormous, roughly 1/3 of Russia's entire territory. It's packed with timber, minerals, freshwater fish, and farmland. And how many people live there? Around 8 million. That's it. 8 million people spread across an area bigger than all of Western Europe. And the population is shrinking as young Russians move west to Moscow and St. Petersburg looking for jobs and opportunity. Now look directly across the border. The 3 provinces of northeast China hold around 100 million people. 100 million. Pressed up against a nearly empty land full of resources. Nature hates a vacuum. And so does economics. Chinese businesses have been leasing vast tracts of Russian farmland. Chinese logging. Companies have moved deep into Siberian forests. And Russian environmentalists have complained for years about forests being stripped and shipped south. Chinese traders, workers, and investors have become a growing presence in Russian border cities. None of this is illegal. None of it is an invasion. Every contract is signed. Every lease is approved. Often, local Russian officials welcome it because Chinese money is the only money coming in. And that's the genius of it. Russia isn't losing the Far East to soldiers. It's losing it to signatures. Meanwhile, the Kremlin can't say a word. Because Moscow needs Beijing far too much to complain about a few million hectares of farmland or a mapping guideline. Putin, the man who invaded a neighbor over historical claims, has to smile and stay silent while China quietly rewrites the historical narrative about Russia's own territory. But the swallowing doesn't stop at Russia's borders. It's happening in Russia's backyard too. For 200 years, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan was Russia's zone, first under the Tsars, then under the Soviet Union. Even after 1991, Moscow treated the region as its private sphere of influence. Russian was the common language. Russian pipelines carried the region's energy. Russian soldiers guaranteed the region's security. Not anymore. China's Belt and Road Initiative, the largest infrastructure project in human history, was literally launched in Kazakhstan in 2013. Since then, Chinese money has poured into Central Asian railways, highways, pipelines, and power plants. China has become the top trading partner for most of these countries. Chinese pipelines now pull Central Asian gas eastward. gas that once had no route to market except through Russia. And in 2023, something remarkable happened. Xi Jinping hosted all 5 Central Asian presidents at a grand summit in China. Russia wasn't invited, wasn't needed, wasn't mentioned. 20 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. Today, it's just Tuesday. Even in the Arctic, the region Russia considers its frozen crown, China is pushing in. Beijing has declared itself a, quote, near Arctic state, despite being nowhere near the Arctic. It talks about a polar Silk Road through Russian Arctic waters. And because Russia desperately needs investment for its Arctic gas projects after Western companies fled, Chinese firms have bought major stakes in projects like Yamal LNG, piece by piece, region by region, contract by contract. And then there's the military dimension, the one area where Russia always felt superior. For decades, the relationship was clear. Russia built world-class weapons and China bought them. Fighter jets, missile systems, submarines. Russia was the teacher, China was the student. That relationship has now flipped completely upside down. The war in Ukraine has drained Russia's military industry, and to keep its war machine running, Russia now depends heavily on Chinese components, chips, drones, machine tools, optics, vehicle parts. Western officials estimate that a huge share of the critical foreign components found in Russian weapons on the battlefield now come through China. Chinese-made dual-use goods, items that can serve both civilian and military purposes, flow into Russia in massive volumes. Read that again. The Russian army, the army Putin calls the second strongest in the world, can no longer fight its war without Chinese supply chains. If China turned off that tap tomorrow, Russia's defense industry would seize up within months. Beijing knows this. Moscow knows this. And knowing that someone can switch off your army changes everything about who's really in charge. Okay, quick checkpoint, because we're about to enter the deepest part of this story. If this video has already changed how you see the Russia-China relationship, don't just watch silently like China swallows Russia. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell because I make videos like this every single week. And the algorithm only shows them to people who ask for them. Done? Good. Because now we need to answer the hardest question of all. Why is Putin allowing this? He's not naive. He's a former intelligence officer. He spent his entire career studying power, leverage, and dependency. He can see exactly what's happening. Russian nationalists can see it too. Some of them openly complain that Russia is becoming, in their words, a raw materials appendage of China. So why doesn't Putin push back? Because he can't. And this is the trap. The beautiful, brutal, perfectly constructed trap that Putin built for himself. Follow the logic. Putin invaded Ukraine partly to stop NATO's influence and restore Russia's status as a great power. The invasion triggered sanctions. The sanctions cut Russia off from the West. Being cut off from the West forced Russia into China's arms. And dependence on China is now destroying the very sovereignty and great power status Putin went to war to protect. He fought the West to avoid becoming, in his mind, a vassal of America. And in doing so, he turned Russia into something dangerously close to a vassal of China. It's one of the most extraordinary ironies in modern history. Russia spent 500 years expanding eastward, growing stronger, absorbing territory, dominating its neighbors. And now, the current may be reversing. Not through war, but through weakness. Here's what makes Putin truly helpless. He has no alternative. None. He can't turn back to the West. The war in Ukraine burned that bridge for a generation, maybe longer. He can't rely on India alone. India buys Russian oil, yes, but India can't replace China's manufacturing, China's technology, or China's financial system. He can't rebuild self-sufficiency overnight. Russia's economy was integrated with the West for 30 years, and rebuilding domestic industry takes decades, not months. So every year the war continues, the dependency deepens. Every sanction that stays in place pushes another Russian industry into Chinese hands. Every Western company that never comes back leaves shelf space for a Chinese brand. Time itself is working for Beijing. And China? China plays it perfectly. Notice what Beijing does not do. It doesn't send soldiers to Ukraine. It doesn't officially violate Western sanctions in ways that would trigger massive retaliation. It doesn't sign a formal military alliance with Moscow. It doesn't take on any of Russia's risks. Instead, China takes only the rewards. Cheap energy, a captive market for its goods, a neighbor that can never again threaten it, access to Arctic routes, growing influence in Central Asia, and a giant resource-rich partner that grows more dependent and more obedient every single quarter. Chinese strategists have a beautiful old concept for this kind of victory, winning without fighting. Sun Tzu wrote about it 2,500 years ago. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. And what we're watching in real time may be the largest demonstration of that principle in modern history. And here's the psychological layer most analysts miss. Publicly, Putin and Xi perform equality. The handshakes, the state dinners, the joint statements about a multipolar world, both leaders need this theater. Putin needs it to show Russians he isn't isolated. Xi needs it to show he has a powerful partner against American pressure. But watch the details, and the hierarchy leaks through. When Xi visited Moscow in 2023, cameras caught him telling Putin, as they said goodbye, that the world was undergoing changes, quote, "we haven't seen in 100 years, and we are driving these changes together." It sounded like partnership. But notice who was describing the plan and who was listening. Watch the negotiations. China gets Russian oil at a discount. Russia gets Chinese goods at full price. China delays the pipeline Russia desperately needs. Russia approves whatever access China requests. China's banks even restrict transactions with Russian firms whenever American sanctions get scary, leaving Russian businesses scrambling. And Moscow just accepts it. In any relationship, you can tell who holds the power by watching who adjusts to whom. And in this relationship, only one side ever adjusts. Now let's zoom out, because this story isn't just about Russia and China. It's about what the map of power will look like for the rest of this century. Some historians look at Russia today and see echoes of another story, the story of empires that decayed from within while stronger neighbors quietly moved in. The Ottoman Empire in the 1800s was called the sick man of Europe. It still looked mighty on the map. It still had a huge army. But its economy was hollow, its finances were controlled by outsiders, and its territory was eaten away not in one dramatic bite, but through decades of loans, concessions, and dependencies. Is Russia the new sick man, this time of Eurasia? Its population is shrinking. Its best engineers and scientists fled after the war began. Hundreds of thousands of educated Russians left in 2022 alone. Its budget leans dangerously on oil and gas sold at a discount. Its technology sector runs on imports. Its military is bleeding in Ukraine. Meanwhile, its giant neighbor has 10 times its population, 10 times its economy, and infinite patience. Here's a thought experiment that geopolitical analysts genuinely debate. Fast forward 20 or 30 years. Russia, never militarily, loses the Far East. The border never officially moves. The Russian flag still flies over Vladivostok, but the mines are operated by Chinese companies. The farmland is leased to Chinese agribusiness. The trade flows south. The infrastructure is financed by Chinese banks. The regional economy cannot function for a week without Beijing's supply chains. The local officials answer to Moscow on paper, but their budgets depend on Chinese contracts. At that point, ask yourself honestly, who really owns the Russian Far East? That is the modern form of conquest. In the old days, empires took land with armies, and everyone could see it happening. Today, the smartest powers take function instead of territory. They take the economy, the trade routes, the currency flows, the dependencies, and they leave you the flag as a souvenir. The flag stays, the substance leaves. And there's one more twist to this story. Maybe the darkest one for Moscow. Even Russia's greatest strategic assets are quietly becoming Chinese assets. Russia's nuclear arsenal. It deters NATO, which conveniently protects China's northern flank for free, letting Beijing focus everything on the Pacific. Russia's UN Security Council veto, increasingly used in ways that align with Chinese interests. Russia's confrontation with the West. It absorbs American attention, American weapons, and American political energy, all resources that might otherwise be focused on China. In other words, Russia isn't just becoming economically dependent on China. Russia is becoming strategically useful to China, as a shield, as a distraction, and as a resource base. Some Western analysts have started using a blunt phrase for this arrangement: Russia as China's gas station, mine, and buffer zone. And the truly remarkable thing, nobody in Beijing ever had to demand any of it. Putin delivered it, all voluntarily, step by step, decision by decision, war by war. So what happens next? There are really only 3 roads ahead. Road 1. Russia somehow ends the war, mends fences with parts of the West over many years, and rebalances away from Beijing. Possible, but with the current leadership, almost unimaginable. The distrust runs too deep now on both sides. Road 2. Russia accepts its new role. Junior partner, resource supplier, strategic sidekick. A proud nation swallowing its pride, decade after decade, because the alternative is collapse. This is the most likely road, and it's already the one Russia is walking. Road 3. Russia eventually resents its dependence so much that the friendship happened before, in the 1960s, when the Soviet-Chinese alliance shattered into hostility. But back then, Moscow was the stronger side and could afford the split. Today, Moscow is the weaker side. A split now wouldn't liberate Russia. It would strand it, and that's the checkmate. Every road that keeps Putin in power runs through Beijing. He knows it. She knows it. The only people not supposed to know it are the Russian public, which is why Russian state television talks endlessly about victory over the West, and almost never about the price being paid in the East. There's a strange sadness to this story if you step back far enough. Russia is a civilization of extraordinary depth, the country of Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky, of Sputnik and Gagarin, of scientists and chess champions and mathematicians who shaped the modern world. A nation that survived Napoleon, survived Hitler, survived the collapse of its own empire. And yet it may end up losing more sovereignty through friendship than it ever lost through war. Not because China defeated it, but because its own choices left it with no one else to lean on. Empires rarely fall the way movies show, with fire and final battles. More often, they fall the way Hemingway described bankruptcy, gradually, then suddenly. First, the currency changes, then the trade changes, then the investments change, then the influence changes. And then one day, historians look back and realize the moment everything shifted happened years earlier. Quietly, in a contract nobody read, in a discount nobody questioned, in a pipeline deal nobody could refuse. The bear still roars. The bear still shows its teeth to the west. But behind it stands a dragon, calm, patient, holding the bear's food, the bear's money, and the bear's future. And the dragon never needs to roar at all, because the loudest power in the room is almost never the strongest one. So here's the question I'll leave you with, and I genuinely want your answer. 50 years from now, when historians write about the fall of Russian power, will they point to a battlefield in Ukraine, or to a quiet series of signatures in Beijing? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and the best comment gets pinned at the top for everyone to see. And if this video taught you even one thing you didn't know, share it with someone today, because understanding how power really moves is the first step to never being fooled by it. History is being written right now, silently. Make sure you're not the one who missed it.